I married my husband through thick and thin, but dinners weren't included. This phrase caused laughter from the women at our table, but it seemed to me that Janine Chesterfield was not joking at all. She told us about her husband, David, who was fired from his job as chief financial officer at an Atlanta architecture firm. He needs to find another job and stop sitting at home before I go crazy, she continued. I sympathize with people who have lost their jobs during these difficult times, so it seemed to me that Janine was too strict with her husband. But since she, like me, was a graduate of Agnes Scott College, I decided to try to help her. After lunch was over, I walked up to her table and introduced myself. Mrs. Chesterfield, my name is Sarah Cannon. I know how difficult it is to be unemployed, and I also know that finding a job now takes much longer than usual. I have a temporary vacancy that may interest your husband and at the same time relieve you of his constant presence at home. Her interest was immediately piqued. "Keep going, Ms. Sarah." "Well," I began, "the accountant my law firm has worked with for many years is retiring, and I thought this would be a good time to move our accounting system to computers. I estimate that it will take a competent accountant a couple of months to set up our books on the new system. I won't be able to pay much, but it will give your husband something to do during the day, and I'll be happy if he continues to look for work while he works for me. Do you think he'll be interested in this?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "David will definitely be interested." "Of course," I said, handing her my business card, "I will need to talk to him first and make sure he has the necessary qualifications for the job. Have him call me to set up a meeting." "Thank you, Miss Sarah," she said. "David will definitely call you." I was in a good mood as I walked back to my office in the Virginia Highland neighborhood of Atlanta. I love helping people, and if I can do a favor for a former student of Agnes Scott, so much the better. If, as I expected, David Chesterfield had the opportunity to help me with my books and get them in order, it would be a win-win for everyone, a real win-win, as they say now. But when I returned to the office, my good mood disappeared faster than a snowflake in Atlanta. There was a message waiting for me from Betty Mallinson, who asked me to call back urgently. Her husband, Herman, filed for divorce due to irreconcilable differences. Of course, the fact that he had moved out of the house and moved in with his former secretary might have had something to do with the disagreement, but since Georgia had a no-fault policy, the reasons for the breakup didn't really matter. When you practice family law like I do, situations like this are all too common, and this divorce could have been a fairly routine matter. But the Mallinson case looks set to drag on for many months. I've already spent several calls and meetings watching this unhappy couple bicker over one issue or another. But in my opinion, none of the issues they argued about seemed particularly significant. However, when the heart hurts, it tends to bring out the worst in people. And this was especially evident in the Mallinsons. This divorce already looked complicated, but then an additional complication arose that only added fuel to the fire. This complication is Herman's lawyer, Rosa Brindisi. Rose had a well-deserved reputation as the fiercest divorce lawyer in Atlanta. Her nickname was Atomic Italian because, when she strikes, no one is left alive. No, seriously, I'm not making this up. In reality, Rosa was a large woman of Italian descent with long black hair and a taste for publicity. She was also a skilled cook who, as you might guess, specialized in Italian cuisine, so it wasn't uncommon to see her in the gossip pages, attending wine tastings or cooking Italian dishes for charity events. I didn't care about her publicity, but I didn't like her take no prisoners approach to family law. The story going around in Atlanta is that one of her clients was a man who married an Eastern European woman and brought her to the States. He subsequently regretted his decision and hired Rosa to handle the divorce case. Not content with a simple case of irreconcilable differences, Rosa allegedly got the poor woman deported and then filed for divorce on the grounds of desertion. I can't say that this story is true, but I can easily imagine that Rose could use such tactics. Anyway, my heart sank when I saw the message from Betty. I just knew that this meant another legal shot from Herman and Rosa in their quest to win the case. But before I could call her back, my phone rang. When I answered, I was relieved to realize that it was not Betty, but David Chesterfield, who had called to introduce himself and set up an appointment for an interview. Now that I had decided to modernize my financial records, I couldn't wait to get started, so I asked him to come over in the morning. I hope he can do the job, I told myself. I've been putting this off for so long, and now I'm ready to start. And if he really is the right man for the job, I added with a smile, that would keep Janine away from his presence for a while. When David arrived the next morning, he seemed much different than I had expected after speaking with his wife. He was in his late 40s, had a pleasant face, and was very polite. He seemed like a nice young man and quickly made a good impression on me. We talked at length about the work that needed to be done, and he told me about his job at an architecture firm. I hadn't thought about it, but David pointed out that there are many similarities between the way architects and lawyers do business, working with individual clients, paying by the hour, and so on. And as it turned out, he was already setting up the accounting system of his former company. Of course, it was important for me to find out why the company decided to fire him, and he was completely frank in his story. The collapse of the residential and commercial real estate markets brought new construction to a virtual standstill, and architects felt the pressure as much as developers. His company was forced to cut costs, and he was one of the victims. I was upset that I was fired, but I don't take it personally, he noted. I saw their financial results and understood how difficult it was for them. Firing me and outsourcing my accounting services was the smart decision. What a mature approach he has, I thought. I'm not sure I would be able to be so philosophical about this situation if it happened to me. Anyway, I think I can do a really good job for you, David concluded. I would be very grateful for this opportunity, and I know that Janine will be very happy not to have me under her feet. He smiled as he said this, but it seemed to me that there was something more in his tone besides self-irony. Despite his home situation, as far as I could tell, David's experience and qualifications were almost perfect for me. In addition, he was polite and had pleasant manners. I thought he would be a pleasure to work with, so I extended my hand to him and said, "Well, David, I think we have a deal. You can start tomorrow if you want. Let's go have lunch so I can tell you more about the job, and you can meet my assistant Cindy." Cindy McCarthy is my current research assistant. She also graduated from Agnes Scott College. I love hiring recent graduates from this college to give back in some small way to the school that has given me so much. In addition, I know that their graduates will always be smart, well-educated, and well-mannered. Of course, because of Cindy, I sometimes had to doubt the latter quality. I don't mean to say that she wasn't a lady, but sometimes she didn't dress properly. I understand times have changed, but some of her outfits. But I couldn't scold her too much because she had proven her worth to me more than once in a variety of ways. She had the character to cope with difficulties, good looks, a good head on her shoulders, and, most importantly, a kind heart. Despite my reservations about her dressing style, I was very pleased with her work. Lunch for three was very pleasant. David was a good conversationalist and had a pleasant sense of humor, which made the time fly by. This only reinforced my opinion that it would fit perfectly into our small office. After he left, I asked Cindy her opinion of our new colleague. Although she was young, I found that she had a good sense of people, so I was glad that she didn't have any doubts about him. He seems like a really nice guy, and I liked that when I talked to him. He looked me in the eyes and not down, she said, pointing to her chest. She giggled and added, "It's not that he didn't look, he just didn't stare." "Oh, Cindy," I chided her. "What should I do with you, girl?" The next day, I called Betty Mallinson to find out what the next crisis was. As I suspected, she received a new offer from Herman and his Italian-American lawyer. "Miss Sarah," she said boringly, "I don't know if this is a good offer or not." "Tell me what else they're up to, Betty," I said with a tired look. "Well," she said, "Herman is offering me a house in exchange for waiving child support. What do you think, Miss Sarah? Should I agree?" I just sighed. At first glance, Herman's new offer seemed generous. As part of the proposed property division, The Mallinsons initially agreed to sell the house and split the proceeds. The mortgage on the house had long been paid off, so the sale was expected to bring in a considerable amount of cash. But selling a home in Atlanta during these recessionary times has been a challenge. With a large number of foreclosed and distressed sales still awaiting buyers, homes spent an average of more than 200 days on the resale market. The Mallinson house was no exception. It had been on the market for some time without a single offer. As a result, the house was not as valuable an asset as it once was. Betty, I explained, that wouldn't be beneficial for you. Herman is trying to get you a house that's not for sale so he can keep more of his money and spend it on his girlfriend. But he told me the house was worth more than $400,000, she sobbed, and so the whole amount would go to me. Betty, your house may have been worth $400,000 before the crisis, but it's not worth that much now. Moreover, it costs you nothing if you can't sell it, and until it is sold, you will have to pay for utilities, property taxes, and many other expenses. Without child support and without a job, how are you going to do this? Oh, she said, I hadn't thought of that. Let me call his lawyer and let her know we can't accept this offer, I said. Okay, Miss Sarah, she said hesitantly, if you think it's best. I sighed again as I hung up. Couldn't Betty see that her husband was just trying to confuse her in order to take advantage of a situation that he himself created? But at the end of the day, I think that's why I'm in this business, to help people like Betty avoid falling into the traps that others set for them. Well, there was no point in putting it off any longer, so I dialed Rosa Brindisi's office. When the secretary answered, I introduced myself and asked to speak with Ms. Rosa about Mallinson v. Mallinson. She put me on hold. I knew Rosa Brindisi a little. We met at several Bar Association events, and of course, I knew her by reputation. But this was the first time we had to cross swords. I was curious to know what it was like to deal with her. Hello, Ms. Sarah, boomed a contralto voice with a slight accent. It's nice to talk to you again. The pleasure is entirely mine, Ms. Rosa, I replied. I know you're a very busy woman, so I'll get straight to the point. Herman Mallinson's proposal to replace child support with their house will not pass. Betty will need an income to support herself after Herman leaves. No judge will refuse to support her in these circumstances. I could almost hear a smile on the phone. Well, it was worth a try. Herman told me that she was excited about the idea of getting full ownership of the house. I didn't like it at all, and I'm afraid I spoke a little harsher than I should have. Miss Rosa, this is a simple case with no complications or unusual circumstances. Let's just let them divide the property fairly and be done with it. It seems to me that all these offers and gimmicks are just wasting our customers' time and money. This time she laughed. Oh, Miss Sarah, this is what we work for. Before I could express my outrage, she said, Sorry, honey, I have to run, ciao. With these words, she passed out, and it was for the best. I don't think anyone wanted to hear what I said next. Over the next few weeks, I felt increasingly confident in my decision to hire David. He seemed to intuitively understand what needed to be done and did not hesitate to get down to business. Cindy tried to help him by telling him where the various files were and describing the procedures we used to track time spent on various tasks. I felt great confidence in this project. One day, after David had gone home, Cindy came into my office and I asked her how she thought David was coping. Oh, I think he's doing well at work, she said. I immediately caught her unspoken comment. Is something going wrong, baby? Well, she mused, it seems to me that he's not very happy at home. He doesn't talk about it much, but I get the clear impression that things aren't going well between him and his wife. You don't pry into his personal life, right? I asked quickly. No, ma'am, Cindy assured me. It's just that some of the things he said gave me that impression. Like what, baby? I encouraged her. Well, you know how he said his wife wanted him out of the house? So he told me that she wasn't joking. She practically forbade him to come home, at least during the day. Well, I said, I can understand a woman who wants to have a little time to herself, but I can't imagine her denying him entry to his own home. I asked David the same thing, Ms. Sarah. He told me it was because she started a small business. She sells underwear from her home. Seeing my confusion, Cindy continued, "It seems like this is something she started about a year ago. She invites her friends and their acquaintances to buy this special French lingerie, which cannot be found in stores. They come to try it on and have a good time. She told David she didn't want him in the house because she was afraid the man's presence would scare away customers." "I think I heard about this," I said, "but I didn't think that it could be a profitable business. How much laundry can you sell this way?" "Well, I've heard of things like this, but I've never bought anything this way," Cindy replied. "Anyway, David says Janine seems to be doing well and is really enjoying having her own money. Now she's starting to host lingerie parties to attract even more people than the ones she knows. But it seems to me that the more time she spends on her business, the less she has left for David," Cindy concluded. "Well, honey, I think it's unfortunate, but you and I had better not get involved. It's up to David and Janine. They don't need strangers sticking their nose into places they weren't invited," I said sternly. "Yes, ma'am," she replied. The following week, Betty Mallinson called me and wanted to meet me immediately to discuss her husband's latest proposal. From the moment I met Rosa Brindisi, I was sure that something new would definitely happen. I quickly learned that my fears were not in vain. "He's done it again, Ms. Sarah," Betty moaned. "Now he's trying to make me pay rent." I thought we were done with the house after my last conversation with Ms. Rosa. I was wrong. When I looked at Herman's last sentence, I could easily understand why Betty was so upset. This is so like her, I got angry. In short, what Rose and Herman have now come up with is to suggest that Betty pay rent to live in her own house. I was furious. He leaves to have an affair with another woman, leaving his wife in the lurch. Now he wants Betty to pay him rent until the house is sold. Where is the justice here? Poor Betty, of course, was terrified. "I just don't understand, Ms. Sarah. It was he who left me for this FIFA, and now it turns out that I am being punished for what he did." "I think you're absolutely right, Betty," I assured her. "There is no reason for him to try to rip you off like that. If you don't mind, I'll go to his lawyer again and try to talk to her in an amicable way." Betty was very grateful and immediately agreed. I picked up the phone and called Rosa Brindisi's office. When I got through, I was told that Mrs. Brindisi was in a meeting and could not be disturbed. "Probably eating a plate of pasta in his office," I thought sarcastically. "I understand, honey," I told the secretary. "Could you check Ms. Rosa's calendar and see if she has any free time to discuss the Mallinson case?" We agreed on a time and date, and I agreed to come to her office. "It looks like I'll have to meet the spider in its lair," I thought. Then she chided herself. "Shame on you, Sarah Cannon. A good Christian woman should not have such ignoble thoughts. You can't miss church this Sunday. You need to remind yourself of the rules of conduct." That afternoon, I asked David to come see me before he left to get a report on the progress of the computerization project. We discussed the action plan and the necessary steps for a smooth transition to the new system. We had a good talk about everything, and he assured me that the project was going well. "How are you, David? Is everything all right?" I asked. "I really enjoy working here, Ms. Sarah. I enjoy this type of work and am very grateful for the opportunity. Besides, you and Cindy have been so good to me that I almost don't want to go home at night." I knew he was trying to be funny, but again I felt a bitter note in his voice. "David, I don't want to mind my own business, but is everything okay between you and Janine?" I asked carefully. His face darkened, and at first I thought he was angry. But then he sighed heavily and began to say in a quiet voice, "No, Miss Sarah, everything is not okay with us. Over the past year or so, Janine has become cold and distant towards me. She started this small business of her own." I interrupted him. "Yes, Cindy told me about her home-based lingerie sales." "About? Well, anyway," he continued, "it looks like her little business is all she cares about now. Essentially, she and I live separate lives. He blushed a little and continued, "Our marital relationship has practically come to an end. If I didn't come home at all, I think she wouldn't be particularly upset." "Oh, David," I said, "I'm so sorry to hear that. It's probably not that bad." "Miss Sarah," he said, "when I came home early the day I was fired, Janine literally kicked me out of the house. She said I was going to interrupt one of her sales. I was already in a bad mood about losing my job, so you can imagine how I felt after that. I spent the rest of the day at the tavern drinking beer, and since then things have gotten even worse. It seems like she wants me to be at home as little as possible. Even when I have to be home during the day, she wants to know exactly when I'm coming and how soon I'm leaving." He sat up straight and tried to pull himself together. "But I didn't want to burden you with my problems, Ms. Sarah. I truly love working with you and Cindy." "David," I said, "I'm so sorry your marriage is going through such a difficult time. If there's anything I can do to help, or if you just want to talk about what's going on anytime, I promise you it's not a burden to me." He thanked me and slowly walked towards his car. I was really upset about David's situation, but I couldn't do anything other than offer him friendship and understanding. I didn't have time to think about David any further because the next day I had an appointment with Rosa Brindisi about the Mallinsons' case. I needed to reconsider their last offer and think through my strategy. At the appointed time the next day, I got in the car and drove to Buckhead, where Rose's office was located. Many years ago, Buckhead was a beautiful suburb of Atlanta. Although the northern part of the neighborhood still has elegant homes and green courtyards, its center has become a major business district with shopping malls and gleaming glass office towers. Rose's office was located in one of these high-rise buildings. At least there was covered parking, so my car wouldn't get too hot while I went to the meeting. When I reached her floor, I was quickly escorted to Rosa's office. She was talking on the phone when I came in. She covered the receiver with her hand and said, "It will only take a minute," and returned to her conversation. While she was talking, I took the opportunity to look at her. Her long black hair was pulled up into a bun, and she wore one of her signature red dresses. Today's version was the color of tomato marinara sauce. It amused me to watch her talk. She used her hands so much that it's a wonder she didn't drop the phone. When she finally ended the call, she hung up and said, "Sorry, honey, it took longer than I expected. I hope you don't mind meeting here. I thought it would be easier for us." I thought Rose wanted to hold the meeting in her office so she could have the advantage of speaking from behind her impressive wooden desk. Rose is a large woman, but rather short. I could see that her chair and table were raised so she could look down on her guests. It didn't bother me. She quickly went into negotiation mode, pulling out a fresh copy of the latest proposal she and Herman had made to Betty. "My client believes that since Mrs. Mallinson will continue to enjoy the benefits of living in their home, while my client will not, it is fair that she pays my client a reasonable monthly rent until the home is sold and the proceeds will not be divided," Rose stated. "I would only notice," I answered softly, "that Mr. Mallinson is not enjoying the advantages of living in their house because it was he who decided to leave it and live elsewhere." I could see that Rose had been expecting such an objection and had prepared her answer, so I quickly continued. "However, Mrs. Mallinson is quite prepared to accept your client's offer." My unexpected agreement surprised Rosa so much that the air came out of her lungs as if from bellows. Obviously, she did not expect such an answer and was not ready for a change in direction. While she was trying to gather her thoughts, I took advantage. "However," I said, "if my client becomes a tenant in her own home, we believe that her new landlord should pay the maintenance costs of the property. We note that having Mrs. Mallinson in the home to monitor and ensure proper operation of the heating, cooling, and water heating systems is very beneficial to Mr. Mallinson. Failure of even one of these systems will undoubtedly harm any chances of ever selling the property. She is well deserving of compensation for providing such services. Moreover," I continued, again ahead of Rose, "Mrs. Mallinson's presence in the house to maintain it and keep it clean and ready for showing to potential buyers is a valuable service. If Mr. Mallinson were to hire such services on the open market, I am sure they would cost him a considerable sum. Rose began to complain, but before she could respond, I had one more thing to add. Finally, we regret to note that there have been a number of burglaries in the area where the Mallinsons live. Having someone in the home providing ongoing security monitoring is another valuable service that Mrs. Mallinson is willing to provide for an appropriate fee. Then I handed Rose a sheet of numbers. As you can see, there are quite a few items related to the proper maintenance of the property, and we have assessed their market value. In fact, Mrs. Mallinson already provides many of these services in connection with her residence at the property and is quite willing to continue to provide them provided she receives adequate compensation. Accordingly, we expect Mr. Mallinson to offset the rent he proposes to charge against the total cost of these services. Rose looked at the leaf and began to boil. Wait a minute, Miss Sarah, this is outrageous. The cost of all these services exceeds the rent my client is offering for the house. Indeed it is, I replied, but my client is a generous woman. She is quite willing to waive these payments if your client waives his rent demands. Of course, if he doesn't agree, we can put both proposals before the court and let the judge decide what's fair. Rose stared at me for a minute with a calculating expression on her face and then relaxed. Very clever of you, Ms. Sarah. I did not expect such a move. Well, given all these considerations, I think my client will be willing to waive his demand for rent for Mrs. Mallinson and consider this case closed. I extended my hand to her and said sincerely, I'm so glad to hear that, Rose. Divorce is always a painful process. If you and I can help this couple get through it without unnecessary strife, I think it will be better for everyone. She shook her head and responded to my words with a grin. I knew she thought I was naive. By the way, she said, watching me carefully, is it true that David Chesterfield is working for you now? Suddenly, I became wary. I wonder how she knows this, I thought. Actually, it is Ms. Rosa. Why are you asking? Oh, nothing special, she said casually. Ciao, Signora Cannon. The whole trip back to Virginia Highland, I was tormented by doubts. When I returned to the office, the day was almost over. When I entered the reception area, I saw David putting papers in his desk drawers and turning off his computer, preparing to leave. However, Cindy seemed nervous at her desk, and when David finally left, she came to my office door. Come in, darling. What's happened? Is something bothering you? I asked. Miss Sarah, I did something in a hurry today, and now it's bothering me. I hope I didn't do anything wrong. Oh, honey, I thought, what has she done? If you knew Cindy, you would know that she has a tendency to act impulsively. You can tell me about it, I encouraged her. Sarah, I really like David. He seems like such a nice guy and easy to talk to, Cindy began, and it's obvious he's so unhappy. Well, Cindy, I said sternly, are you, by any chance, into him? He's a married man, my dear. No, no, Miss Sarah, she protested quickly. I really like him, but we're just friends. It would have calmed me down more if she had looked me in the eyes when she said this. But I kept my concerns to myself and asked her to continue the story. So what did you do, honey? Well, Miss Sarah, I just thought it was weird that his wife wanted him out of the house every day. I know he told you about selling lingerie, but it just didn't fit in my head. I mean, Mrs. Chesterfield can't see clients every day, can she? I agree, I said. That seems strange to me too. Exactly, Cindy nodded. So I got curious and well, instead of going to lunch, I went to their house. I was amazed. Cindy, I don't think that was a good idea. You really have no right to spy on Mrs. Chesterfield. If David finds out about this, I'm afraid he will be very upset. I know, Miss Sarah, I know. I kept telling myself the same thing all this time while driving to them. In fact, I was almost turning around and heading back when the strangest thing happened, Cindy said. As soon as I approached their street, I saw a car drive up to the sidewalk in front of their house, and two men got out of it. They went to the door and knocked. A man inside opened the door and spoke to them. Then he let them into the house. I thought Mrs. Chesterfield was selling lingerie to ladies. She was indignant. This seemed strange to me too, but I didn't want to encourage Cindy's wild imagination. Perhaps the men just came to pick up what their wives ordered, I suggested. Maybe, she said doubtfully, but that's not all, Miss Sarah. When I saw it, I knew I had to take a look at myself. You couldn't, Cindy, I gasped. Oh yes, I could, she replied with a smile. I decisively walked to the door and knocked. When it opened, the same man was standing there. He was as big as a nightclub bouncer and had a shaved head. To be honest, I was a little scared and just stood there. Anyway, he asked what I wanted, and I told him I was there for a lingerie party. Miss Sarah, he looked at me like a dog looking at a steak, and then he asked, "Are you one of the girls?" I didn't understand what he meant, so I just said that I had heard about all these beautiful things Mrs. Chesterfield was selling and wanted to come to the party to see them. He told me very coldly, "This party is by invitation only," and told me I had to leave. Cindy was clearly outraged by this reception. I tried to persuade him, but he just slammed the door in my face. I couldn't think of anything else to do but go back to work, she finished. Miss Sarah, I hope I didn't cause any problems for David, but I think there's something weird going on there, and I don't want him to get in trouble. I, too, began to have a bad feeling about what Cindy had seen, and I agreed with her concern for David. A lot of things just didn't add up to what we were all told. But I didn't want my assistant to try to play detective again, so I told her, "I don't know exactly what to think about this, Cindy, but I don't think we should do anything right now. I want to think about everything for a day or two before jumping to any conclusions. But I know one thing for sure. You should under no circumstances tell David about this. Your trips to his house and wild accusations about what is happening there will greatly upset him." I tried to be as firm as possible so Cindy would understand. She looked upset. "Yes, ma'am," she promised. The next morning, I met with Betty Mallinson to tell her that Herman was refusing to demand that she pay him rent to live in her house. She was grateful that one problem had been resolved, but was still bitter about the impending divorce. "I'm sorry," I told her. "No one can stop this if Herman wants to end the marriage. All I can do is protect you within the law." "I know, Miss Sarah, and I am very grateful for everything you have already done for me. I just feel like a fool, you know, like a woman who was abandoned." "Betty," I told her, "I want to make a prediction for you. At some point in the future, you will have the last laugh. When an older man leaves for a younger woman, in most cases, it does not last long. He can't keep up with her, and she gets tired of him. If this happens to Herman, you may have the opportunity to decide whether you want him back or let him go." Betty clearly saw the irony of the situation if my prediction came true. I think she felt a little better when she imagined how one day she would be in a different role. It was a small consolation, but sometimes that's all you can get. A few days later, Cindy, David, and I were all in the office when the doorbell rang. Cindy went to open it, and I didn't notice, but a few minutes later, she came into my office with tears in her eyes. "What happened, child?" I asked worriedly. "What happened?" "Oh, Miss Sarah, this is David. He's so upset. His wife filed for divorce." With these words, she handed me the package that the bailiff had just handed to our friend and colleague. I quickly looked through the papers. It was basically a standard divorce petition citing irreconcilable differences as the reason. But I also noticed two things that were clearly out of the ordinary. First, attached to the envelope was a letter to David from Janine instructing him not to return home. "Our marriage is over," she wrote. "I don't want to see you anymore." That was cruel, I thought. The second surprise was even greater. A note for me. Written in intricate handwriting, the note read, "Meet again, Signora Cannon," and was signed, of course, by Rosa Brindisi. She seemed to represent Janine Chesterfield's interests. I must admit that for a minute my emotions got the best of me. On the one hand, I was deeply saddened for David. During the weeks that he worked for me, I became very attached to him, and it was unpleasant for me to see his marriage end so bitterly. At the same time, I was deeply offended that Rosa Brindisi saw fit to serve David with a subpoena right in my office. No doubt she was offended by the way I was able to thwart her little tricks in the Mallinsons' case, and she chose this way to humiliate me. All this time I carefully avoided interfering in David's affairs. But now it seemed that I would be dragged into this anyway, regardless of my desire. Well, as the great Caesar said, the die is cast. The first thing I did was go into my office and call a friend to see if he had some time for me. When he agreed, I returned to Cindy and David. "David," I said, "if you want me to take your case, I'll be happy to take it." He immediately agreed. "Cindy," I continued, "I need to do a little research this afternoon. I want you and David to take care of things here in the office while I'm gone. And David, you'll need to find a place to stay tonight. Tomorrow morning, we will hold a small council of war. But until then, I want you to promise me that you won't try to contact Janine. Don't call her, and for heaven's sake, don't go home. Cindy, that goes for you too." "Yes, ma'am," they both replied with serious expressions on their faces. The next morning, I asked them both to come to my office. When David and Cindy sat down on the sofa, I took the rocking chair and began to say, "I'm not happy. I hate that Janine treats David so harshly, and I'm not happy that she used me as a way to keep David from coming home. I am unhappy that Janine used the opportunity created by my job offer to David to plot her divorce. Finally, I don't like that Rosa Brindisi used this unpleasant situation as a chance to humiliate me in my own office." I took a deep breath. I'm not used to interfering in other people's affairs, and although I was sad that David was suffering, I believed that his relationship with his wife was a private matter and not ours. But after everything that happened, I think Janine and Ms. Rosa made it our business, and it's time to start getting answers. From the very first moment I met Janine, she complained that she wanted David away from home during the day. "David, you've been telling us that she's been trying to keep you away for at least the last year. When she filed for divorce, she made sure to remind you not to come home." And that's not all. I turned to David. "Last week, our Cindy became so interested that she decided to play detective. She went to your house. Cindy, tell David what you saw." Cindy quickly recounted the details of her little scouting trip, and David's face darkened as he listened. When she finished, he turned to me. "Ms. Sarah, I don't know what this all means, but I really don't like it. If you had told me this a month ago, I would have been sure that there was a good reason for all these strange happenings. But after everything that happened, I can't help but think that everything that happens in my house has bad intentions." "I agree," I told him. "All this strange behavior seems to be related to your home. I think it's time to visit Janine Chesterfield and see for ourselves what's going on there." I thought for a moment and then asked, "David, am I correct in understanding that you are listed as a co-owner on the deed to the house?" "Yes, Miss Sarah," he confirmed. "Janine and I are both listed on the deed." "Very well, then I think it is time for the homeowner to inspect his property," I told him. "But what about her note telling me not to come home anymore?" he asked. "I understand that these are her wishes," I said firmly, "but you have just as much right to be in this house as she does. You don't need an invitation. In fact, it's best that she doesn't wait for you. Now I feel like midday is when things happen there, so let's have an early lunch and then go there." There are a lot of restaurants near the Virginia and Highland intersection, so I asked Cindy to go get some sandwiches for us. It didn't take long since we were early, and she was back in no time with lunch for the three of us. The sandwiches were delicious, but none of us finished our food. I think we were all too nervous. By the time we finished, it was a little after noon, and the three of us piled into my car since it was the biggest. I drive an old Buick LeSabre, and although they are no longer made, that's no reason to pass up a car that still performs well. Plus, it's convenient for me to drive. We headed towards the area where David and Janine lived. They lived in an area that had been in decline for many years, but was now beginning to revive a bit. Many of the houses had interesting architecture, but were somewhat dilapidated. David and Janine bought a large old two-story house that they planned to renovate. It was a hot summer day, and there was little activity on the suburban streets. As we approached David's house, we decided to drive around the block first to try to understand what might be going on. We saw several cars parked on the street in front of the house, but did not see anyone entering or exiting. There was an alley behind all the houses on his street, and David suggested driving there. When we drove down the alley, we still couldn't see anything, so we parked behind David's house. After a short discussion, we all got out of the car and walked towards the back of the house. The backyard was filled with old trees and bushes, so we could walk up to the house without fear of being spotted. It reminded me of playing cowboys and Indians as a child. At the back of the house, there was a large screened porch. We saw that there was no one there, and there was no one in the kitchen, which opened onto the veranda. My heart was pounding, and I thought, I'm too old for these games. Nevertheless, we climbed the 3 wooden steps to the veranda and carefully opened the door. Everyone winced when the hinges on the screen door creaked, but we needn't have worried. From the veranda, we could now hear loud music playing in the house, drowning out any noise we might have made. "What's going on there?" David whispered. I turned to Cindy. "Did you take your camera with you, honey?" "Yes, ma'am," she confirmed. "Okay, here's what I think we should do. David, since you are the homeowner, you have every right to enter your home, even if Janine doesn't like it. However, it would be much better if you could do it discreetly. Just go inside, have a quick look around, and then come back and tell us what's going on there." "Got it, Ms. Sarah," he replied grimly. Taking the key out of his pocket, he carefully opened the back door and quietly entered the kitchen. Then he walked down the hall and out of sight, and Cindy and I spent an eternity waiting for him to return. After many minutes, David appeared at the back door and walked out onto the veranda. His face was pale, and he motioned for us to go outside so we could talk freely. "I can't believe it, I just can't believe it," he repeated over and over again. "What did you see?" Cindy demanded. He looked at us with a stunned expression on his face. "That loud music seemed to drown out everything, so at first I thought no one was there. Then I heard a noise from the living room, so I tiptoed over there and looked around the corner. There were 2 couples there, and here he became embarrassed, looking at me. They were making love." Cindy was amazed. "Who were they? Was that your wife?" David looked at us helplessly. "I've never seen one of them in my life." "Where was Janine?" I asked him. "I didn't see her. Maybe she's upstairs," he replied. "Let's go upstairs and have a look," Cindy urged him. "Wait, just wait a minute," I said firmly. "Cindy, give me your phone." When she gave it to me, I walked away and quickly made a call. After talking for a couple of minutes, I hung up, returned to the 2 of them, and returned the phone to Cindy. Both looked at me with curiosity, but we didn't have time to explain. "David," I whispered urgently, "can you slip back into the house and open the front door? When you do, come back right away." He nodded in agreement and disappeared inside again. A few seconds later, he returned. "Okay, Ms. Sarah, I opened the front door and removed the latch from the screen door. I don't think anyone heard or saw me. They were probably too busy with, other things." "Okay," I told them both. "I think it's time for us to check out the top floor of the house. Cindy, get ready to shoot." "Just a minute, Ms. Sarah," David said. "Let me go up there alone, and then I'll come back and tell you what I saw." I'm already bleeding. "No," I said. "They got us all involved in this, and we all have to figure out what's going on here. Plus, we need Cindy to take pictures of everything that's going to happen, and I want to make sure you don't do something rash. We're all going together." I hoped I was doing the right thing. David was surprised that I wanted to go inside, but he was too eager to find out what was going on in his house to argue with me. He gritted his teeth, and the 3 of us returned to the house. The music was still playing, but the groans and sighs coming from the living room were now loud enough to make it clear that the activities he had witnessed earlier were still in full swing. Step by step, careful not to make a sound, David led us upstairs. "Oh my God," I thought as I followed him up. The high ceilings in these old houses make for really steep stairs. On the second floor landing, we found a corridor with several doors leading to rooms on the sides. Good thing we had David with us to guide us. He led us down the hallway to the master bedroom. The door was slightly open, and he carefully pushed it open. We shouldn't have tried so hard to be invisible. It would take a fire alarm to interrupt the scene unfolding before us. Janine lay on the bed with a scarf over her eyes. She was naked. Her arms and legs were spread apart and tied to opposite ends of the bed. She moaned continuously, and as we listened, we gradually began to make out her words over the music that sounded throughout the house. "Oh, yes, yes," she repeated, "right there. Yeah, keep doing it. Don't stop, don't stop." Next to her, there was a large man with a shaved head. Cindy, who had been taking photos since the door opened, turned to us and whispered, "This is the same man I saw earlier, the one who told me to leave." David's face contorted with anger, and I had to grab his arm tightly to keep him from storming into the room and making a sound. I knew he wouldn't be able to hold it in for long. I whispered to him, "I know you want to push her, David, and I think now is the time to do it." I squeezed his hand again before he could move. "But promise me you won't touch her," I added urgently. He nodded and unclenched his fists. With firm determination, he entered the room, and Cindy and I remained standing at the door. The couple on the bed were so engrossed in their carnal pleasures that David was able to come close to the bed and stand next to them before they noticed him. Suddenly, he bent down and tore the cloth from his wife's eyes. She blinked, trying to clear her vision, and he shouted in a loud voice, "So this is what you do while I'm at work." She screamed in fear and surprise and began to struggle with the ropes that held her, but to no avail. Meanwhile, her muscular lover jumped out of bed in shock to see the man standing over him. He frantically began to pull up his underwear. I think most men feel quite vulnerable when their private parts are exposed. When he finally pulled up his boxers, his confidence seemed to return. He stood up straight and started shouting angrily, "Who the hell are you, and what the hell are you doing here?" Janine continued to struggle in vain with her bonds, but stopped for a moment to cry out, "This is my husband." She then turned to David, who stood with his arms crossed and a furious expression on his face, and told him, "I can explain it all, David. It's not what you think." At that moment, she noticed Cindy and me standing in the doorway. She started talking, but then she saw me and froze in surprise. "Miss Sarah, my God, what are you doing here?" With these words, she turned to David and began to beg him to cover her body, which was still naked in front of us. David didn't move. The bald man started cursing. "Get the hell out of here. If you don't leave right now, I'll throw you out of here." Looking at his biceps, I had no doubt that he was quite capable of doing this. But before he could carry out his threat, we heard a noise from below and footsteps coming up the stairs. A uniformed policeman brushed past Cindy and me and entered the room. Pointing to the large man and Janine, he said, "You are both under arrest for running a sex house." David gasped when he heard this, and Janine, tied to the bed, began to thrash and thrash. But her hefty lover was not going to give in. "You have no right to break in here like that. This is a private residence. You cannot enter this woman's house without a search warrant." The policeman looked at him with contempt. "We don't need a warrant," he said coldly. "The owner of the house invited us to come in." Without wasting any time, the police officer began handcuffing the large man. Meanwhile, I felt sorry for Janine and waved for Cindy to help untie her while I covered her with the robe that was lying at the foot of the bed. When Janine was released, Cindy helped her into her robe. Then David's wife was also handcuffed and taken downstairs. All this time, David did not move to help her. I didn't blame him. We all made it downstairs just in time to see the 4 participants in the orgy below being led out to a waiting police car. Janine and her bandit friend followed them. The policeman we saw earlier was waiting for us. "That was a pretty good operation that she put together here, Ms. Sarah," he said. Apparently, she and her friend were offering businessmen the opportunity for a little afternoon exercise. He waved a hardcover notebook in front of us. Everything is recorded here, he said, names, dates, and payments. More than enough to secure a conviction. He grinned. This gives new meaning to the expression businessman's lunch. After the police left, we helped David lock his house. I know a good cleaning company, I told him. They can sanitize and clean everything. We returned to the car and began the journey back to my office. David remained deathly silent, but Cindy was filled with questions. How did you know what was going on here, Miss Sarah? I didn't know, honey, I told her, but everything you and David told me made me very suspicious. The day before our little meeting, I decided to visit an old friend in the Atlanta police and talk with him. He told me that in the area there had been several reports from the local neighborhood watch about strange cars on the street and strangers coming and going from the house throughout the day. They began to suspect that illegal drugs might be being traded there, but they did not have sufficient grounds for a search warrant. When I told him what Cindy had observed earlier, it raised his suspicions that the house could be used for sex trafficking. Then I let him know that we were going to pay a visit. If we found anything that could confirm his suspicions, I promised that I'll call him. I also assured him that there would be no need for a warrant because the owner of the house would invite them to come in and see for themselves. After David saw what was happening in the living room, I told my friend what was happening and told him that his officers were free to come in and see for themselves. Who was that big guy, that bouncer? Cindy wanted to know. I can't say for sure, dear, but I suspect that he was Janine's partner in this matter in addition to being her lover, I replied. David frowned darkly. I understood that he was still hurt and offended. It's amazing that despite everything we've been through, it was still mid-afternoon when we got back to the office. We were still emotional from everything that had happened, and I decided to try to take care of one more thing that I needed to complete. I asked Cindy to print copies of photographs of Janine and her lover, as well as photographs of her being led away in handcuffs by police. While she was doing this, I sat down at the computer and printed out the petition with the appropriate names. I then called Rosa Brindisi's office and asked if it would be possible to visit her to discuss the case Chesterfield v. Chesterfield. Rosa's secretary put me on hold so she could go check on me. She quickly returned and said that Mrs. Brindisi would be glad to see me at the end of the day. I bet she can't wait to make fun of me for serving David a subpoena right in my office, I thought with a sour smile. I told Cindy and David about my plans, and they both wanted to stay to hear how it would turn out. I got back into my car and headed to Rosa's office. I hate driving in Atlanta, especially during rush hour, but today I was ready to make an exception. When I arrived at Rosa's office in Buckhead, I didn't have to wait long to see the great lawyer. Her secretary led me into her office and sat me down on a chair next to her impressive desk. She probably thinks of it as her throne, I thought. Dressed in a red tomato-colored blouse and a black skirt, Rose literally beamed with joy that I had come to her. She looked at me like I was looking at a plate of veal marsala ready to be eaten. Well, Ms. Sarah, it looks like we crossed swords again sooner than you expected. Do you have any other tricks in your arsenal for me this time? She giggled. I smiled at her and replied, No tricks this time, Ms. Rosa, just one question. She sat smugly waiting for me to continue, so I asked, I know you practice family law, but have you recently gotten into criminal defense as well? Rose frowned impatiently. No, of course not. Why are you asking that? Have you by any chance spoken to your client today, Mrs. Chesterfield? I continued. No, not since we talked yesterday. What's this all about, Ms. Sarah? Why all these stupid questions? Well, I said, if you need to contact her, you'll have to go to the Atlanta Detention Center where she's being held on a sex trafficking charge. With that, I tossed several pictures of Cindy onto her desk. They clearly showed Janine, wearing a robe and with her hands handcuffed behind her back, being taken out of the house by police. Rose gasped in shock. For the first time, this woman was speechless. But don't worry, Rose, even if you don't do criminal defense, Mrs. Chesterfield will still need your services. My client, Mr. David Chesterfield, is filing a counterclaim for divorce. but his lawsuit is not based on irreconcilable differences. Then I threw the petition that I had just prepared onto her large table. Attached to the cover was a photograph of Janine tied to a bed, captured in the act of infidelity with her lover. I turned and headed towards the door of her office. On the way out, I turned around, waved to her, and said, "Ciao, Ms. Rosa." She was still sitting there with her mouth open, staring at the photographs in front of her. When I returned to the office, David and Cindy were still there. They couldn't wait to hear what happened and were delighted when I described my encounter with Rose. Cindy seemed to pick up on my feelings about Atomic Italian, and I knew David was still angry that Janine had served him with a divorce summons. Their laughter at Rosa Brindisi's confusion helped lift everyone's spirits after such a stressful day, but I could see it would take David a long time to recover. "Are you going to be okay?" I asked him. But before he could answer, Cindy grabbed his hand and hugged him tightly, heading towards the exit. "Don't worry about David, Miss Sarah. I think I can cheer him up," she said. I could only imagine. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think. Click to the next one. Click to the next one. Click to the next one.